The transport ship broke through the atmosphere of Station Zenith with a loud rumble. Inside, Commander Jake Morrison sat with his hands gripped tight on the armrests. He had flown combat missions before, dropped into war zones, faced down enemies that wanted him dead. But this made him more nervous than any of that. This was humanity's first real chance to join the galaxy. One mistake, and Earth would be watching from the sidelines for another century. The station appeared in the viewport. It was massive, bigger than anything humans had built. Rings of metal spun around a central core, each section housing a different species. Lights blinked in patterns Jake didn't understand. Ships of strange designs docked and undocked in a careful dance. "It's beautiful," Lieutenant Amy Chen said from the seat beside him. She pressed her face close to the window, like a kid seeing snow for the first time. "It's intimidating," Lieutenant Danny Foster added from behind them. "Look at the size of some of those ships. We're flying in a tin can compared to that." Jake couldn't argue. The human transport was new, their best work, but it looked primitive next to the alien vessels. Everything about this felt like showing up to a genius convention with a basic calculator. The docking process took 20 minutes. Automated systems guided them in, which was good because Jake wasn't sure their pilot could have managed it manually. When the airlock finally sealed and the green light came on, Jake stood and straightened his uniform. "Remember the briefing," he said to the 12 officers behind him. "Be respectful. Be calm. Don't touch anything unless invited. And for the love of everything, don't make jokes about eating anyone." That last part was aimed at Danny, who had a bad habit of using humor when he was nervous. The young lieutenant gave an innocent shrug, but nodded. The airlock opened. The air that rushed in smelled strange, like metal and something floral Jake couldn't identify. The temperature was cooler than the ship, making his skin prickle. Director Kreshtar waited on the other side. The briefing files hadn't prepared Jake for the reality. The director stood nearly 8 feet tall, covered in scales that shifted from green to blue depending on the light. His eyes were large and golden, with vertical pupils that focused on Jake with unsettling intensity. When he spoke, his mouth revealed rows of sharp teeth. "Commander Morrison, welcome to Zenith Academy." The words came out harsh, each syllable precise. The translator device on his chest glowed as it worked. "I am Director Kreshtar. I oversee all training operations." Jake stepped forward and extended his hand, a gesture they'd been told was understood by most species. "Thank you for having us, Director. We're honored to be here." Kreshtar looked at the hand for a long moment before gripping it. His palm was rough and cold. The handshake lasted exactly 2 seconds before he pulled away. "Follow me. I will show you to your quarters and then the training facilities. Your cadets will begin integration exercises tomorrow morning." They walked through corridors that were too wide and too tall for human comfort. Other beings passed them, some walking, some floating, some moving in ways Jake couldn't quite figure out. Every single one stopped to stare at the humans. Some looked curious. Others looked hostile. A few looked hungry, which Jake tried not to think about too hard. Amy leaned close to him. "They really don't like us, do they? Can you blame them?" Jake kept his voice low. "We've got a reputation. Every species we've met so far, we've either tried to fight or tried to sleep with. Sometimes both." "That was first contact scenarios with no prep time," Amy defended. "We're better now. We'd better be." The quarters were functional but bare. Rooms with sleeping platforms, basic facilities, and not much else. Jake didn't complain. He'd slept in worse places. After they'd dropped off their gear, Kreshtar led them to the training hall. That's when Jake truly understood the scale of what they were attempting. The hall was enormous. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above them. The floor was marked with different colored zones, each one sized for a different species. Equipment lined the walls, some of it recognizable, most of it completely foreign, but it was the other cadets that caught his attention. There were hundreds of them. divided into groups by species. Jake recognized some from the briefing materials. The tall, thin ones with too many joints were the Norians, an aquatic species that wore special suits on land. The ones that looked like walking crystals were the Silent, beings made of living mineral. The insect-like creatures with multiple arms were the Threx, and they moved in perfect unison like a hive mind. And then there were the Vryn. Jake had read about them, but seeing them in person was different. They looked like someone had taken a big cat, made it walk upright, added a bit of lion, a bit of tiger, and then given it intelligence and weapons. Adults stood 6 to 7 feet tall, covered in fur that ranged from black to gold to striped patterns. Their faces were feline, but wrong in ways that hit the uncanny valley hard. Their eyes were too aware, too calculating. The cubs were smaller, maybe 4 feet tall, but they moved with a grace that made Jake think of predators playing at being prey. They wore training uniforms and carried practice weapons. Even from across the hall, he could see the discipline in how they stood. "The Vryn are our finest warriors," Kreshtar said, noticing Jake's attention. "For 10,000 years, they have produced the most effective soldiers in the galaxy. Their training methods are without equal." Jake watched as an instructor, a massive Vryn with silver fur, barked orders at a group of cubs. They moved instantly, no hesitation, forming perfect lines and executing combat drills with mechanical precision. "They're kids," Amy said quietly. Jake heard the concern in her voice. "They are warriors in training," Kreshtar corrected. "Age is irrelevant. Capability is what matters." Jake bit back his response. This was going to be harder than he thought. Human military had its own tough training programs, but they still remembered that kids needed to be kids sometimes. These cubs looked like they'd forgotten how. "When do we start integration?" Jake asked. "Tomorrow. 0600 station time. Your cadets will be paired with members of other species for basic exercises. We will evaluate their performance and compatibility. And if there are problems," Kreshtar's eyes narrowed, "then we will know that humanity is not ready for the responsibility of joining our community. This is not just training, Commander. This is a test, one that many species believe you will fail." He walked away, leaving the humans standing in the massive hall, surrounded by beings who didn't want them there. Danny moved up beside Jake. "No pressure, right, boss?" "None at all," Jake muttered. Amy was still watching the Vryn cubs. "Something's wrong there. Did you see their eyes? They look exhausted." "Not our problem yet," Jake said, though he'd noticed the same thing. "Let's focus on getting through tomorrow, without starting an interstellar incident." But as they left the hall, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow was going to change everything. He just didn't know if that change would be for better or worse. 3 weeks had passed since the humans arrived at Station Zenith. Jake had stopped counting the number of times other species had complained about his people. Too loud. Too casual. Too emotional. Too friendly. The list went on, but they were still here, which meant they hadn't failed yet. The morning started like any other. Jake woke at 0500, ran through the human section of the station, and met his team for breakfast. The food was getting better as the station kitchens figured out what humans could actually eat without getting sick. "Big day today," Amy said, pushing something that looked like eggs around her plate. "Combined tactical exercises. We're finally working directly with the Vryn cubs," Danny groaned. "Great. More fun with the fun police. Show respect," Jake warned, but he understood the frustration. The Vryn instructors ran their training sessions like prison camps. Everything was about discipline, order, and suppressing any hint of personality. The cubs never smiled, never played, never did anything except follow orders. It bothered all the humans, but there wasn't anything they could do about it. Different species, different methods. The training hall was already busy when they arrived. Instructor Velmoth stood at the center, his silver-striped fur catching the overhead lights. He was the head combat trainer for the Vryn cubs, and he ran his sessions with absolute authority. The cubs feared him, which Jake supposed was the point. "Humans, Velmoth's voice carried across the hall. The translator made it sound even harsher than it probably was. You will pair with Vryn cadets for navigation exercises. The scenario is simple. Your ship has crashed on a hostile world. You must work together to reach the extraction point. You have 2 hours. He began calling out pairs. Jake was matched with a large Vryn male named Throknal, who looked at him like he was something stuck to the bottom of a boot. Amy got paired with a female, who at least seemed neutral. Danny was called last. Lieutenant Foster. You will work with Cadet Rix-Ala. A young Vryn stepped forward. He was smaller than the others, his fur a lighter brown with white patches. He didn't meet Danny's eyes when he approached. Hey, Danny said, keeping his voice friendly. I'm Danny. Looking forward to working with you. Rix-Ala gave a stiff nod but said nothing. The exercise began. Teams scattered to different training zones, each one set up to simulate different terrain. Danny and Rix-Ala got assigned to the Rocky Mountain Zone, which meant climbing and careful navigation. For the first 30 minutes, they barely spoke. Danny tried to make conversation, but Rix-Ala only responded to direct questions about the exercise. The Vryn was competent. Jake had to give him that. He moved through the fake terrain with confidence, his natural agility making the climbing look easy. But he also looked tired. His movements were precise, but slow, like he was running on fumes. You okay? Danny asked during a brief rest. You look beat. I am functional, Rix-Ala replied. It was the most personal thing he'd said. That's not what I asked. Rix-Ala's ears flicked back, a sign of discomfort Danny had learned to recognize. My condition is not relevant to the mission. Danny let it drop, but he filed it away. Something was wrong here. They were halfway through the course when Danny heard a small sound behind them. He turned and saw a tiny Vryn cub, much younger than the cadets, peering around a piece of training equipment. That's my sibling, Rix-Ala said quietly. Kesna. She is not supposed to be here. The cub was small, maybe 3 feet tall, with golden fur and ears that were too big for her head. She looked at Danny, with bright green eyes full of curiosity. Hey there, Danny said softly. He knew he shouldn't engage, that it would probably cause problems, but the cub looked so interested. Kesna took a step closer, then another. She was staring at something in Danny's hand. He looked down and realized he was still holding his ration bar. He'd been eating it during the rest break. The cub's nose twitched. She made a small chirping sound. Are you hungry? Danny knelt down slowly, making himself less threatening. Do you want to try some? Don't, Rix-Ala warned. But Kesna was already moving forward. Danny broke off a small piece of the ration bar and held it out on his palm. The cub sniffed it carefully, then took it with surprising gentleness. She chewed it, her eyes going wide, and made a happy chirping sound. Good, right? Danny smiled. It's supposed to taste like chocolate, but I think they missed the mark. Kesna chirped again and stepped even closer. Before Danny could react, she grabbed his arm with her small paws and started climbing. In seconds, she was perched on his shoulder, her tail wrapping around his neck for balance. She was purring, a deep rumbling sound that Danny could feel through his whole body. The training hall went completely silent. Danny froze. He could feel every eye in the hall on him. Slowly, carefully, he turned his head and saw Instructor Velmoth staring at them. The massive Vryn's fur was standing on end, his tail lashing back and forth. His mouth opened to roar a command. Every species in the hall stopped what they were doing. Some of the aliens stepped back. A few moved their hands to weapons. The tension was thick enough to cut. Danny's heart was pounding, but he forced himself to stay calm. The cub on his shoulder was so small, so warm. She chirped again, completely unaware of the situation she'd created. Commander Morrison appeared at the edge of Danny's vision, moving slowly and deliberately. Jake's face was calm, but Danny could see the concern in his eyes. This could end everything. The Vryn took their military culture seriously. A cub showing affection to a stranger, especially an alien, was probably the worst possible breach of protocol. Velmoth took a step forward. His claws were extended. Every line of his body radiated anger. "Instructor," Jake said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "May I speak?" The request seemed to surprise Velmoth. He stopped, his eyes never leaving the cub on Danny's shoulder. After a long moment, he gave a sharp nod. "Your cubs are warriors," Jake began. "I've watched them train. They're disciplined, skilled, and dedicated. Among the finest I've seen." Velmoth's tail slowed its lashing. Just slightly. "But they're also children," Jake continued, "and I think maybe that's something that got forgotten somewhere along the way." A low growl started in Velmoth's chest. Several other Vryn instructors moved closer, forming a semicircle around the humans. Amy stepped up beside Jake. "In human culture, we have something we call pack bonding," she said. "It means we form connections easily. Some species think it makes us weak, but it's actually one of our greatest strengths." "How can emotional attachment be strength?" Velmoth demanded. "It clouds judgment, creates hesitation, weakness. Does it?" Jake looked around the hall. "Or does it give you something worth fighting for? Something worth protecting?" Danny stayed perfectly still. Kesna had settled on his shoulder. Her small body relaxed against his neck. She wasn't afraid. She felt safe. And somehow, that felt important. Other sounds started filtering through the silence. Danny glanced around and saw that more Vryn cubs had stopped training. They were watching Kesna with something in their eyes that looked like longing, like they remembered something they'd been forced to forget. One of them, a small male with black fur, took a hesitant step toward Lieutenant Kate Sullivan. She knelt down slowly, the same way Danny had. The cub approached, cautious but curious. "No," Velmoth barked, but his voice lacked its usual authority. He was watching something shift in his perfectly ordered world, and he didn't know how to stop it. More cubs were moving now, approaching the humans carefully. The other instructors looked to Velmoth, waiting for orders, but he stood frozen. Jake took another step forward. "We're not trying to undermine your training, Instructor. We're not trying to make them weak. But maybe, just maybe, there's room for both. Discipline and joy. Strength and compassion. Warriors who remember what they're protecting." Kesna chose that moment to rub her face against Danny's cheek, purring louder. The gesture was so innocent, so pure, that something seemed to break in the tension. Velmoth closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the anger was gone, replaced by something Danny couldn't quite read. Confusion, maybe. Or doubt. "This session is ended," Velmoth announced. "All cadets return to quarters." Now, the cubs hesitated, but discipline won out. They moved toward the exits, many of them looking back at the humans with new interest. Kesna chirped in protest but slowly climbed down from Danny's shoulder. She looked up at him one more time, her big green eyes full of trust, then scampered after her older sibling. As the hall emptied, Jake turned to his team. "Meeting in my quarters. 5 minutes. We need to figure out what just happened and what happens next." Danny watched Kesna disappear through a doorway. His shoulder felt cold where she'd been sitting. Something had changed in that moment. Something bigger than a simple breach of protocol. He just hoped they'd get the chance to see where it led. Jake paced his quarters while his team sat in tense silence. They'd been waiting for 2 hours, expecting Director Kreshtar to summon them for immediate expulsion. But the call hadn't come. "Maybe they're still deciding," Amy suggested. "Trying to figure out what to do with us. Or they're preparing formal charges," Kate added. What Danny did could be seen as interference with another species' cultural practices. Danny sat with his head in his hands. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. The cub was just so small and curious, and you did the right thing," Jake interrupted. Whatever happens, don't doubt that. A chime at the door made them all jump. Jake opened it to find a young Vryn standing there, not one of the instructors. The cadet looked nervous. Commander Morrison, Instructor Velmoth requests your presence, and Lieutenant Foster as well. Here it comes, Jake thought. Where? The instructor's private training room. Sector 7. They followed the cadet through quiet corridors. It was late in the station's cycle. Most beings already in their quarters. The private training room was smaller than the main hall, designed for individual instruction. Velmoth stood in the center, his back to them. Thank you for coming, the instructor said without turning. His voice was different from before, lacking its usual harsh edge. Of course, Jake replied carefully. Instructor, if this is about earlier, it is. Velmoth finally turned to face them. He looked tired, older somehow, but not in the way you expect. Please, sit. They sat on training mats, cross-legged. Velmoth remained standing for a moment, then slowly lowered himself to their level. It was such a human gesture that it surprised Jake. I have been an instructor for 30 years, Velmoth began. I have trained thousands of cubs. Every one of them became a capable warrior. I was proud of this, proud that I maintained the traditions of my people, that I upheld the standards that made us the finest military force in the galaxy. He paused, his claws flexing against the mat. This afternoon, I watched a small human show more kindness to a cub than I have shown in decades, and I watched that cub respond with a joy I had forgotten our young could feel. It disturbed me greatly. That wasn't our intention, Jake said. We respect your culture and your methods. Do you? Velmoth's eyes fixed on him. Because your entire species seems to operate on principles that contradict everything we believe. You are emotional. You bond with anything that moves. You treat your young with softness that should breed weakness. And yet, here you are, having achieved space travel, having earned a place at this academy. Danny spoke up, his voice quiet. With respect, instructor, I don't think kindness and strength are opposites. Then what are they? Partners. Sir, back on Earth, our best soldiers aren't the ones who feel nothing. They're the ones who care about their team, who fight to protect the people beside them. The love doesn't make them weak. It makes them stronger, because they have something worth fighting for. 2. Velmoth was silent for a long moment. Show me. Sir, show me how humans train their young warriors. Jake and Danny exchanged glances. This was unexpected. Right now? Yes. I have arranged for a group of cubs to come here. They believe it is for remedial training. Instead, I want you to show me your methods. 20 minutes later, 6 Vryn cubs entered the room. Kesna was among them, her eyes widening when she saw Danny. She took a step toward him, then stopped, looking at Velmoth for permission. Go ahead, the instructor said softly. Kesna rushed to Danny and climbed onto his lap. The other cubs watched with obvious envy. Okay, Jake said, trying to figure out where to start. First question. When was the last time you cubs played a game? The cubs looked at each other in confusion. Rixala, who stood near the back, spoke up. Games are for younglings who have not begun training. We are past that stage. How old are you? 11 cycles. The equivalent of your 10 years. 10 years old, and they'd forgotten how to play. It teaches strategy, cooperation, quick thinking, and creativity. All things that make better soldiers. Amy stood up. Let me show you something. It's called tag. One person is it and has to touch another person. Then that person becomes it. The goal is to not get caught. This is training? One of the cubs sounded skeptical. It teaches evasion, spatial awareness, and cardio endurance, Kate explained. Plus, it's actually fun, which means you'll practice more willingly. They started with simple rules. Danny was at first. He chased the cubs around the room while they scattered, their natural agility making them quick. At first they moved mechanically, treating it like a drill. But then, Kesna giggled when she dodged Danny's hand, and something seemed to unlock in the others. Within minutes, they were really playing. Laughing. Trying to fake each other out. Working together to distract whoever was it. The transformation was remarkable. Velmoth watched from the side, his expression unreadable. After 15 minutes, Jake called a break. The cubs were breathing hard, but their eyes were bright in a way he hadn't seen before. Now, he said, let's add complexity. Same game, but now you can work in pairs. 2 people are it, and they have to coordinate to catch others. But the others can also work together to protect each other. This version was more challenging. It required communication, strategy, and trust. The cubs threw themselves into it with enthusiasm. When it ended, they were all lying on the floor, exhausted but happy. That was training? Rixala asked, breathing hard. That was the start, Amy said. Now let's talk about what you learned. For the next hour, they discussed tactics. How working in pairs was more effective than alone. How communication made coordination possible. How trusting your partner let you take calculated risks. The cubs engaged eagerly, offering ideas and asking questions. It was the most talking Jake had heard from Vryn cubs in 3 weeks. Then Kate introduced something new. On Earth, soldiers often talk about their feelings. I know that probably sounds strange to you, but understanding fear, anger, sadness, and joy makes you better at controlling them. We are taught to suppress emotion, one of the cubs said. Emotion is weakness. Emotion is information, Kate corrected gently. Fear tells you danger is present, so you can prepare. Anger gives you energy when you need to fight. Sadness reminds you what matters, so you protect it. And joy, well, joy reminds you why life is worth living. Kesna spoke up, her voice small. But if we show emotion, we are punished. The room went very quiet. Velmoth's tail had gone still. May I ask why? Jake directed the question to the instructor. Velmoth took a long breath. Because it is our way. It has always been our way. To show emotion is to show vulnerability. To show vulnerability is to give your enemy an advantage. But these cubs aren't your enemy, Danny said. They're your students. Your children. In warrior culture, there is no distinction. Softness anywhere creates weakness everywhere. Amy leaned forward. Does it though? Or does it create warriors who can't adapt, can't think creatively, and can't handle anything that doesn't fit their training? Velmoth's claws dug into the mat. You dare to question 10,000 years of tradition? No, sir, Jake said calmly. We're questioning whether that tradition is serving your people as well as it could, whether there might be a better way that still honors your values of strength and discipline, but doesn't require your children to stop being children. The cubs were watching this exchange with wide eyes. This was probably the first time they'd ever heard adults disagree openly. Velmoth stood abruptly. The cubs flinched, expecting anger, but when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. I need time to consider this. Cubs, return to your quarters. Tell no one of what happened here tonight. The cubs left reluctantly, Kesna looking back at Danny with clear disappointment. When they were gone, Velmoth turned to the humans. Your methods disturb me, he said honestly. They go against everything I was taught, everything I have taught others. But I cannot deny what I saw tonight. Those cubs learned more in 1 hour than they typically do in a week. They were engaged, creative, and working together naturally. So what happens now? Jake asked. Now I must decide if I am brave enough to consider that my entire life's work might have been wrong. That is not an easy thing for a warrior to admit. He walked to the door, then paused. But perhaps that is what true strength is. Not the refusal to change, but the courage to change when presented with a better path. After he left, Danny let out a long breath. Did that just happen? I think, Amy said slowly. We might have just started a revolution. Jake looked at his team. They'd come to Zenith Academy to prove humans belonged in the galaxy. He hadn't expected they'd end up challenging the galaxy to change along with them. But maybe that was exactly what needed to happen. Get some rest, he told them. Something tells me tomorrow is going to be interesting. The summons came early the next morning. Jake barely had time to finish his coffee before the message appeared on his terminal. Director Kreshtar wanted to see him immediately. Alone, the walk to the director's office felt longer than usual. Jake ran through possible scenarios in his head. Expulsion seemed likely. Formal complaints to Earth's government. Maybe even charges of cultural interference. He'd known the risks when he encouraged his team to engage with the Vryn cubs. But knowing didn't make facing the consequences easier. The door opened before he could knock. Kreshtar sat behind a desk that looked too small for his frame, but what surprised Jake was that Instructor Velmoth was also there, standing near the window. Commander Morrison, Kreshtar said. Sit. Jake sat, trying to keep his face neutral. Instructor Velmoth came to me last night with a very unusual request, the director continued. He wants to implement significant changes to the Vryn training program. Changes based on human methodology. Jake glanced at Velmoth. But the instructor's expression gave nothing away. He also told me about the unsanctioned training session you conducted, Kreshtar added, with cubs who should have been in their quarters. Sir, I can explain. Kreshtar held up a hand. I'm not interested in explanations. I'm interested in results. The question before me is simple. Did your methods produce better outcomes than our traditional approaches? Jake chose his words carefully. Sir, I believe there's value in both approaches. The discipline and skill the Vryn teach is remarkable, but adding elements that let cubs be cubs while they learn to be warriors might make them more effective in the long term. Might, Kreshtar repeated. You're asking us to change methods that have worked for thousands of years, based on might. No, sir. I'm suggesting we test whether adding human elements to existing methods produces measurable improvements. Keep what works. Add what helps. Remove what doesn't. Velmoth finally spoke. I want to try. For 1 month. 6 cubs will train using combined methods. 6 others will train traditionally. We compare the results objectively. Kreshtar leaned back in his chair. And if the traditional methods prove superior, then we acknowledge that human approaches don't work for Vryn, Jake said. And we adjust our expectations accordingly. And if your methods prove superior, then maybe we all learn something valuable about different ways to achieve the same goals. The director was quiet for a long time. Finally, he nodded. 1 month. But Commander, this experiment happens quietly. If it fails, I don't want it becoming a diplomatic incident. Understood? Finally, understood, sir. One more thing, Kreshtar added. Other species are watching this. If humans can successfully integrate with the Vryn, it opens doors. If you fail, those doors close. Not just for you, but for your entire species. The weight of that responsibility settled on Jake's shoulders. We won't fail, sir. The next 4 weeks became the most intense of Jake's career. He worked with Velmoth and a small team of human instructors to blend training methods. It wasn't easy. The Vryn instructor had decades of ingrained beliefs that clashed with human approaches. You let them question orders, Velmoth said during one heated discussion. That undermines authority. No, Kate argued. It teaches them to think critically. In combat, conditions change. A soldier who only knows how to follow orders can't adapt when communication breaks down. Then you train them to follow orders even when communication breaks, Velmoth countered. But what if the orders are wrong? Amy asked. What if the commander doesn't have information the soldier on the ground has? A good military teaches soldiers to think, not just obey. These debates happened daily. Sometimes, loudly. But slowly, grudgingly, they found middle ground. The experimental group included Rixala and Kesesna. Jake watched them carefully over the weeks. The changes were subtle at first. They started asking questions during briefings. They offered suggestions for alternative tactics. They smiled occasionally. But the real test came during a complex training scenario in week 3. Both groups, experimental and traditional, were given the same mission: infiltrate a mock enemy base, retrieve intel, and extract without detection. The traditional group performed exactly as trained. They followed their plan precisely, moved with perfect discipline, and completed the mission in 43 minutes, with no errors. It was textbook perfect. The experimental group started the same way. But 5 minutes in, they encountered a complication that wasn't supposed to be there. A malfunctioning training drone had wandered into their path, creating an obstacle the plan didn't account for. Jake watched from the observation room as the cubs stopped, confused. In traditional training, they would have been taught to abort and request new orders. But Rixala did something different. He gathered his team quickly. They talked in low voices for maybe 30 seconds, then split up. 2 cubs created a distraction, while the others found an alternate route. They adapted to the situation, completed the mission in 48 minutes, and demonstrated creative problem-solving. Velmoth watched the replay 3 times without speaking. The traditional group was faster, he finally said, but only because they didn't encounter problems, Jake pointed out. The experimental group solved a problem that wasn't in the plan. That's what matters in real combat. Jake pointed out. Other differences emerged. The experimental cubs recovered from failures faster. When they made mistakes during drills, they discussed what went wrong and tried again. The traditional cubs, when they failed, seemed paralyzed by shame and took much longer to regain their composure. The experimental cubs also worked together better. They developed trust, knowing their teammates would support them. The traditional cubs were skilled but operated more as individuals following the same orders rather than as a true team. But the most striking difference was something harder to measure. The experimental cubs seemed happier. They approached training with energy and enthusiasm. The traditional cubs approached it with grim determination. Happy soldiers are more effective soldiers, Lieutenant Ben Parker observed during one of their review sessions. Back on Earth, we learned that morale isn't just about comfort, it's about giving people reasons to push through hard times. By week 4, even the traditional training group had noticed the differences. Some of the cubs started asking why they couldn't join the experimental program. Others began questioning their instructors, mimicking behaviors they'd seen in the experimental group. It's spreading, Velmoth told Jake one evening. They were watching a training session where cubs from both groups were running drills side by side. The traditional cubs see the others laughing, bonding, and they want that too. Is that a problem? I don't know yet. The instructor's tail twitched. Change is difficult, Commander. Especially when it challenges everything you believed was right. I know, Jake said. But maybe that's growth. Maybe the strongest warriors aren't the ones who never change, but the ones who can adapt even when it's hard. The month ended with formal evaluations. Every cub in both groups underwent physical tests, tactical assessments, psychological evaluations, and team cooperation scenarios. The results would determine the future of the experiment. Jake didn't sleep the night before the final results came in. Too much rode on this. Not just for his team, but for humanity's place in the galactic community. The morning meeting included Jake, Velmoth, Kreshtar, and several other Academy officials. They reviewed data for 2 hours. Physical performance was nearly identical between groups. Traditional cubs had a slight edge in precision. Experimental cubs had a slight edge in adaptability, but the psychological evaluations showed stark differences. Experimental cubs scored significantly higher in stress management, creative thinking, team cohesion, and long-term resilience. They also reported higher satisfaction with training and stronger bonds with their instructors and peers. The experimental group is measurably more well-adjusted, the head psychologist reported. They show lower anxiety, better emotional regulation, and healthier social connections. They're not just better soldiers. They're healthier individuals. Kreshtar studied the data in silence. Finally, he looked at Velmoth. Your recommendation? Instructor? I recommend we expand the program, Velmoth said. The words clearly cost him something. But he spoke them firmly. Not just for these cubs, but for all of them. The human methods work. More importantly, they work without sacrificing the discipline and skill that make us effective. You understand this means changing traditions your people have held for millennia? I understand that traditions should serve the people, not the other way around. If our old ways were producing broken warriors who were effective but empty, then they weren't good traditions. They were just old ones. Kreshtar turned to Jake. And what does Earth expect if we adopt your methods more widely? Nothing, sir, Jake said honestly. We're not trying to make you more human. We're just offering tools that might help. Use them or don't. Adapt them however works for your people. The goal isn't to change who you are. It's to help you be the best version of what you already are. The director nodded slowly. Then, here is my decision. The experimental program continues and expands. But, carefully. We document everything. We measure results. And we remain honest about what works and what doesn't. This is not about humans versus Vryn. It's about finding the best path forward, together. Relief flooded through Jake. They'd done it. Not just saved their place at the academy, but potentially changed the future of an entire species' approach to training. As the meeting ended and people filed out, Velmoth stopped beside Jake. Thank you, Commander, for showing me it's possible to be strong and kind at the same time. I thought I'd forgotten that long ago. Thank you for being brave enough to try something new, Jake replied. That evening, Jake found Danny in the training hall with a group of cubs, including Kesna, who was perched on his shoulder like always. They were playing some kind of game that involved a lot of running and laughing. Kesna saw Jake and chirped happily. Commander! Jake! Do you want to play? He looked at the group of cubs. At their bright eyes and genuine smiles. At the way they moved with joy instead of just discipline. This was what they'd fought for. This moment right here. Yeah, he said, grinning. I want to play. 6 months had passed since that first incident with Kesna climbing onto Danny's shoulder. Station Zenith felt different now. Not just to the humans, but to everyone. The changes had spread beyond just the Vryn training program. Jake stood in the observation deck, watching ships come and go. Today was important. The Galactic Council was meeting to discuss humanity's full integration into the interstellar community. The decision would affect billions of people back on Earth who were waiting to see if they truly had a place among the stars. Nervous? Amy asked, joining him at the window. Terrified, Jake admitted. Everything we've done here could still fall apart if the Council decides we're too disruptive. Or they could decide we're exactly what the galaxy needs. That's the optimistic view. Someone has to have it, she said with a smile. The summons came an hour later. Jake, along with Velmoth, Kreshtar, and several other station officials, transported down to the Council's main facility on the planet below. The building was ancient, predating human civilization by thousands of years. Walking its halls, Jake felt the weight of history. The council chamber was massive. Representatives from 47 different species sat in a circular arrangement, each in a section designed for their specific needs. Some sat in chairs, others floated in containment fields. A few existed in forms Jake still couldn't quite understand. High Chancellor Vex Tar, a being made of crystalline structures that refracted light into rainbow patterns, called the session to order. The translation came through clearly despite the Chancellor having no visible mouth. We gather to discuss the matter of human integration. The species has completed their trial period at Zenith Academy. The Council must now vote on whether to grant full membership status or to deny Earth's petition for another century. That was the rule. If a species failed their trial period, they had to wait 100 years before applying again. For humanity, watching their neighbors explore the stars while they were stuck at home, it would be devastating. We will hear testimony from Director Kreshtar first, the Chancellor announced. Kreshtar stepped forward, his scales shifting colors in what Jake had learned was a sign of careful thought. Honored Council, I was skeptical of humanity when they arrived. Their reputation suggested a species too chaotic, too emotional, too unpredictable to integrate successfully. Jake's heart sank. This didn't sound promising, but I was wrong. Kreshtar continued. Or rather, I was right about what they are, but wrong about what that means. Yes, humans are emotional. They bond easily, sometimes inappropriately. They question traditions and challenge established methods. But these traits, which I viewed as weaknesses, have proven to be strengths in ways I did not anticipate. He gestured to Velmoth. Instructor, please share your findings. Velmoth stepped forward, and Jake noticed Kessna was with him. The cub had become something of an unofficial mascot for the new training program, and Velmoth had stopped trying to maintain the strict separation between instructor and student. I have trained warriors for 30 years, Velmoth began. I believed our methods were perfect, incapable of improvement. The humans challenged this belief. They introduced concepts of emotional wellness, creative problem-solving, and team bonding that seemed counterproductive to military efficiency. He paused, one hand resting on Kessna's head. The cub leaned into the touch, purring softly. The results proved me wrong. Cubs trained with human methods are not just as effective as those trained traditionally. They are more effective. They adapt better. They work together better. They recover from setbacks faster. And most importantly, they are healthier mentally and emotionally. We were creating warriors who could fight, but who had forgotten why they fought. The humans reminded us that even warriors need reasons beyond duty. A murmur ran through the council chamber. Several representatives leaned forward with interest. But the impact extends beyond the Vryn, Kreshtar added. Other species at the Academy have begun requesting human advisors. The Norians want help developing more adaptive training for their aquatic forces. The Threks are interested in human approaches to individual initiative within hive structures. Even the Silenth, who we believed had perfected their methods centuries ago, are asking questions. This sounds dangerously close to cultural imperialism, one council member objected. A being with too many eyes and a voice like grinding stone. Are humans simply imposing their values on others? Jake knew this concern had been coming. He stepped forward when Kreshtar nodded permission. With respect, council member, we're not imposing anything. We share what works for us and let others decide what to adopt. The Vryn didn't copy human methods exactly. They adapted them, kept their own cultural values, and created something that works specifically for them. That's not imperialism. That's collaboration. But you challenge traditions, another member said. You question established ways. This creates instability. Does it? Amy spoke up, and Jake felt a flash of pride at her confidence. Or does questioning traditions ensure they stay relevant? The strongest cultures aren't the ones that never change. They're the ones that can evolve while staying true to their core values. The debate went on for hours. Council members raised concerns about human unpredictability, their tendency to form attachments across species lines, their disregard for established hierarchies. But for every concern, Kreshtar, or Velmoth, had examples of how these traits had produced positive outcomes. Finally, High Chancellor Vextar called for testimony from other species at the Academy. What happened next surprised everyone. Representatives from a dozen different species came forward, not all of them friendly to humanity, but each one had stories. The Threx commander talked about how human instructors had helped her hive develop better individual initiative. A Norian captain described how human emotional intelligence training had reduced casualties in their forces. A silent elder spoke about how human creativity had solved a problem that had stumped their people for decades. But perhaps most telling, the elder concluded, is this simple observation. Before humans arrived, species at Zenith Academy coexisted but rarely truly cooperated. We maintained our separations, our traditions, our barriers. The humans, with their ridiculous tendency to befriend everything they meet, broke down those barriers. Not through force or manipulation, but through genuine interest in others. They made us talk to each other, work with each other, and in doing so, they made us stronger together. The chamber fell silent. Even the skeptical members seemed moved by the testimony. The council will now vote, High Chancellor Vextar announced. The question before us is simple. Does humanity deserve full membership in the Galactic Council, with all rights and responsibilities that entails? The vote took 30 minutes. Each species cast their decision, the results displayed on screens throughout the chamber. Jake watched the numbers climb, his palms sweating. They needed a 2/3 majority. When the final tally appeared, Jake had to read it twice to believe it. 39 in favor, 7 opposed, 1 abstention. They'd won. Not just won, but won by a significant margin. High Chancellor Vextar's crystalline body flashed with light. The motion passes. Humanity is hereby granted full membership in the Galactic Council. Welcome to the greater community. Jake felt Amy grab his arm, squeezing hard. Danny was grinning so wide his face might crack. Even Kreshtar looked pleased, which for a being covered in scales was quite an accomplishment. But the Chancellor wasn't done. There is one additional matter. The Council has reviewed humanity's methods and their effects on other species. We propose the creation of a new program, to be called the Human Integration Initiative. Member species can request human advisors to help develop improved training, cultural exchange, or social programs. This program will be voluntary and overseen by a joint committee. Jake blinked. They weren't just accepting humanity. They were actively asking for human help. Commander Morrison. The Chancellor addressed him directly. Your species came to us as applicants. You leave as partners. Use this responsibility wisely. End quote. We will, Chancellor. Thank you. The formal session ended, but Jake barely remembered the rest of the day. There were celebrations, formal announcements, messages of congratulation from species he'd never even met. Earth would be going crazy right now, he knew. This changed everything for humanity's future. Later that evening, Jake found himself back in the training hall. It was quiet now. Most beings already celebrating or resting. He stood in the spot where Kessina had first climbed onto Danny's shoulder 6 months ago. One small moment that had somehow changed the course of human history. Commander? A small voice made him turn. Kessina stood there with several other young cubs. She'd grown in the past months. Not just physically, but in confidence. She no longer moved with the fearful precision of traditional training. She moved with purpose and joy. Hey, Kess, Jake said, kneeling down. What are you doing up so late? We wanted to thank you, she said. The other cubs nodded. Before you came, training was about duty and discipline, and nothing else. You showed us it could be more. That we could be warriors and still be ourselves. That wasn't just me, Jake said. That was all of us, including your own instructors who were brave enough to try something new. But you started it. One of the other cubs insisted. When Lieutenant Danny let Kess climb on him, when he showed kindness, when everyone expected him to push her away, that changed something. It showed us that strength and kindness can exist together. Jake felt his throat tighten. You know what? You kids changed us too. You reminded us why we wanted to reach the stars in the first place. Not to conquer or to prove we're the best, but to meet others, to learn from them, and to grow together. Kessina stepped forward and hugged his leg, the closest she could reach. The other cubs joined in, creating a pile of purring, happy youngsters around the human commander. Velmoth appeared in the doorway, along with Danny and several other humans. The instructor watched the scene with what might have been a smile. "This is what we're protecting now," he said quietly. "The understanding that we're all stronger together than apart. Think the galaxy's ready for that?" Danny asked. "Probably not," Jake admitted, standing up carefully to avoid disturbing the cubs. "But they're going to get it anyway. Because that's what humans do. We connect, we care, and we bring others along with us, whether they expect it or not." The cubs finally let go, scampering back toward their quarters with waves and happy chirps. Jake watched them go. These young beings who represented a new future where different species didn't just coexist, but truly understood each other. "So what happens now?" Amy asked, joining the group. "Now we get to work," Jake said. "We've got 47 species in the council, and probably half of them are going to request human advisors at some point. We need to train people, develop programs, figure out how to share what we know without imposing what we believe." "No pressure," Danny joked. "None at all," Jake agreed with a grin. They stood together in the quiet training hall, this space where so much had changed. 6 months ago, they'd arrived as uncertain outsiders, hoping to prove themselves worthy. Now they were leaving as partners, trusted to help shape the future of galactic society. All because one small cub had been curious enough and brave enough to climb onto a stranger's shoulder. All because a human had been kind enough to let her. And all because enough beings had been wise enough to recognize that sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest changes. The stars were waiting. The galaxy was ready. And humanity, with all its messy emotions and inappropriate attachments and stubborn refusal to give up on anyone, was finally home among them, not as conquerors, not as servants, but as friends, partners, and family to species that had forgotten what those words truly meant. The future was going to be interesting. Jake couldn't wait to see what happened next.